Okay, I think we are recording.
Okay.
All right, hey there, everybody. This is Carrie with Unleashed. I am still figuring out how to do all of this, so we're just, going as we go. This is, I think, interview number 5 for me. I am here with my friend Jenn. She and I worked together at a school a couple of years ago for, I don't know, I think I was there 7 years, so I knew her 7 years, and she's awesome. Definitely, I like to say, an unsung hero of our school.
Thank you.
I was actually just talking with someone about how much institutional knowledge you had of the
Oh,
that people just didn't know, and when you were gone, it was kind of like, oh no, what happens now? And usually there's this, we don't know what's going on. So definitely, like, you were the nuts and bolts of that place.
oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I loved being there. It was a very hard decision to leave, but things happen and you have to move on. So, and I was never planning on staying there forever. So,
yeah. No, I mean, was in the same boat. It was like a little family, a really special place, but
yes.
you also got to sometimes, like you said, move on.
Yes. Yeah.
So, all right, you're here today because you have, I guess, a difficult school story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
I know you struggled with learning,
Mm-hmm.
but now
Yep.
you're like, awesome. I mean, you were awesome before, but
Right.
clearly your struggle in school did not affect your adulthood in a negative way, but maybe hopefully in a positive way.
Yes. I do think it did. By the time I got into college, it was much easier to deal with. To be honest, the first signs of it were really in first and second grade. And I was struggling to learn to read. And this, of course, education has changed so drastically since I went through school. And when I was little, I was put in like a special reading club kind of thing, because not really a club class, because I was struggling to learn to read. And I was the daughter of 2 educators. My mother was a preschool teacher. My father taught high school math. And I had a brother who's 6 years older than me who learned to read by reading the signs while waiting in the gas lines in the 70s. So he was a bit older than me, and he picked it up, and all of a sudden my mother realized in the car that he was reading, and he was barely 4 years old. So, yeah. So that was a lot to live up to. And, I struggled. And so I think sometimes when parents or teachers, they don't expect their children to have issues. I've seen it in a lot of with a lot of students who have parents who are teachers. They don't think that there's going to be anything wrong or any problems there. And there were early indications of that for me, including I just wasn't as smart as my brother. And I heard that a lot, that I was the artistic one and that he was the bright one. And so that kind of hurt when I was old enough to realize that, because I wanted to be just as smart as he was. So, at any rate, so I struggled with reading, and I was put in special reading. But I will say this, it helped amazingly, not just the pixie sticks I received every time I went to class.
Is that where pixie comes from?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes, in college I kind of OD'd on sugar one night. On pixie sticks, and that's how the nickname came in. My friends started calling me Pixie because I was eating pixie sticks.
I had no idea. I always thought it had something to do with dancing.
Nope. Had everything to do with the fact that I used to get pixie sticks from when I was learning how to read.
Wow. Note to self, or note to the other teachers, don't bribe kids with pixie sticks.
So I would go to the class, and I didn't really think anything of it at the time that I was struggling to read. But I do remember the first book I actually ever read, which was The Gingerbread Man. And that was when we realized I could read. And that was middle of first grade year that I got the book for Christmas from my first grade teacher. And that's the first time we realized I was actually reading. I would memorize books and I could tell the story from start to finish and use the correct words. Like it almost looked like I was actually reading, but it was just memorization. And second grade, my second grade teacher told my parents that there was more in my head than was actually able to come out. And I can remember I was homesick because I was sick a lot. That I had to write a book report on the tale of Jemima Puddle Duck, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't write it. I literally, I sat there and I cried because I couldn't write it. I could tell you the story. You could ask me questions about the story and I could tell it to you, no problem. I couldn't write the report. So when we did our little display on Beatrix Potter, I did get to play Beatrix Potter, by the way, in the class. My report was closed. You could look at everybody else's report, but my report was closed because I couldn't do it. I think eventually I got it down, but I couldn't write it. However, I think around that time too, that I ended up reading the Dr. Dolittle book. And I remember lying in my room and I could feel like I was so transported by this book that I thought I was in the middle of the ocean on a boat, and there was sun and there was, you know, waves and all this sort of stuff like that. And all of a sudden I looked up and around me and I'm like, oh, I'm in my room. So that connected. What?
You really got drawn in.
I really got drawn in, and that changed everything for me, reading wise. My ability skyrocketed. I basically went from barely being able to read to reading on a 12th grade level within a couple of years. And I would read everything, anything from Nancy Drew to, you know, Little Women to, you know, a lot of major books, and I read them really quickly, and I had really good reading comprehension, so that even though I was reading miles above what I was technically old enough to be able to read, I was able to understand what I was reading. So I was reading everything under the sun, and in fact, the joke kind of became, and I never put down a book, so the joke kind of became that Dad would make a comment about me being Alice Roosevelt every time I came to dinner because I always had a book in my hand. I had like my book up in my bedroom. I had my book in my book bag. I had a book at school. I could be reading like 3 or 4 different books relatively at the same time. And that just kept happening all throughout. You know, I'd have my school reading that I'd have to do, but I would have several other books going on at the same time. I was just always reading.
And you could keep them all straight too.
Yes.
That's really impressive.
So from somebody who was struggled to learn to read and couldn't even write the tale, you know, about the tale of Jemima Puddle Duck, to somebody who was reading constantly. And I mean, I was constantly, I was going to the library all the time. And I mean, one of the good things too was that my parents never stinted me on books, and they never censored me on books or what was age appropriate or stuff like that. Okay, so I was reading trashy romance novels that I found under my mom's bed. You know,
open your eyes to all the genres.
Yes, pretty much. So I mean, there's a lot of funny stories about all of that, you know, with that. Unfortunately, however, my math ability did not go that same way, not until college, really. And so I struggled, which was funny because my father was a math teacher, so you would think that wouldn't be an issue. It was. But because I learned to read so quickly, those discussions about me not being able to get things out kind of went by the wayside for a while. And while I wasn't, except for the fact that I read everything, I wasn't an exceptional student. I was average, just average. You know, I was maybe above average in language arts, and that's about it. And maybe social studies, because those were in my wheelhouse, and I just thrived on that with reading and, you know, history. And I loved going to historical sites. And I can remember somebody and Independence Hall when I was about 7 or so being like, she should become a ranger when she grows up because her knowledge of this at the age of 7 is just crazy. Um, but math and science, so not my wheelhouse. So, but with elementary school, and I went to a public elementary school, and I know there's a lot of discussions with public versus private. I firmly feel that if I hadn't gone to an independent or private school, that a lot of where I am today wouldn't have happened. I graduated from elementary school and things were fine. You know, I was pretty much average. And then I went to an all-girls school, a highly competitive all-girls school. And my first year, I think, was all about just getting used to it and getting acquainted with it and stuff like that. So I don't think my grades were horrible, but I don't think they were stellar either. 7th grade was when I really started struggling. And I really struggled with math. I couldn't grasp it. It couldn't come out. And my learning issue, and I'll get more into that when I get to the point where I actually got tested, but my learning issue, I can look at something and I could sit there and stare at it for an hour and not be able to tell you how to do it. But if I was given a hint, I could solve it like that. You know, like I all I needed was just like that one, like put an algebraic equation on the board, for example, and say, I could look at it and be like, yeah, I have no idea what to do with this. And then you just say, well, solve for n. Oh, gotcha. And then I can do it right there. And at this point, I can do it without making any mistakes. At the time, I couldn't. I would make basic computation mistakes. You know, simple math facts. I would struggle with being able to do. So like get addition or subtraction, I would struggle a little bit, especially with subtraction. Addition was easier, but multiplication was also fairly easy. Division was a lot harder. And basic facts of it were I just couldn't get it to come out. So
I see that a lot. And then it makes it harder because your brain is working on those things, and then it makes it harder to do the
right
advanced skills. Or if you get those skills,
right,
then it falls apart for the basic skills. I see that. That's really common.
Yeah. I don't think my problem or disability, and at the time we only called it problem. We didn't really call it a disability, and I don't think it even really they had it named. I think now it's named, but it really did affect my confidence level, because I was in such a small fishbowl with people who were competitive, and it really sucked out my confidence a lot, because I just couldn't get it out. You know, I just couldn't compete with that on that same level at that particular time. So in 7th grade, I came home with my first quarter grades, and I was a mess and in tears. I was failing. I was literally failing, and I was really struggling. So my dad sat down with me, and he worked with the math teacher, who ironically I now work with, by the way. Yeah. And I ended up ending the year with more success than that. And my parents, I think, started thinking about testing at the time, but my brother, who was 6 years older than me, was going off to college, and there was a lot of issues there. And so they were more concerned about that. And he was very anxious and very worried, and he has that as an issue. I'm like, oh, well, you know. He gets the anxiety, I get I can't do math. It kind of works itself out.
You always put effort into your work. You know, you don't start.
Yes, I worked.
A kid who just was like, whatever, I don't care.
Yeah, no, I worked really hard. I tried not to worry about things, is what I really was doing. So, you know, I didn't get tested, and I finally got tested my freshman year in high school, and I was failing algebra. My math teacher was retiring at the end of the year, and she didn't care. So she didn't care that I was struggling. And honestly, now the best thing that ever happened to me was that she failed me, because I ended up going to summer school. And, there's that connotation, summer school is horrible. Only, idiots and losers go to summer school. You have that connotation. And honestly, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. I learned algebra, and I had a good time doing it. I had a great teacher who referenced Monty Python constantly. In fact, we even watched Monty Python in class. We threw chalk at each other. He would hand chalk out, and he's like, all right, when I do something wrong, throw chalk at me, and he'd throw it back at us. And, but I learned algebra. And because I finally learned algebra, I became really successful with Algebra 2, trigonometry, pre-calculus, and calculus. So by my senior year, I was taking calculus classes, which was where I was supposed to be, but I could do it. Unfortunately, geometry is a totally different story to this day.
Not all about calculus.
Yeah, see, I didn't mind it, because I actually really liked problem solving. But I didn't know that at the time, because, I was sort of in middle school made fun of because I wasn't as smart as some of the other kids in my class, and I was struggling. So, but I ended up being very, very successful because I failed algebra in my freshman year of high school. So, any advice I have to parents is number one, don't pigeonhole your child. Don't think that, parents, that your child is not going to be successful because they're not, being successful in school. As I said earlier, I was the artistic one, and my brother was the smart one. When I finally got tested, I clearly remember this, my mother going, oh, you really are smart. And I was so happy to hear that. But now I'm like, really? You didn't think that? Because all I wanted to be was smart. Growing up, I wanted to be the smart kid. So it was just funny because, that was kind of my thing, was that I just really wanted that, and I was. So that really helped. And don't be afraid to that if your child fails. There's nothing wrong with going to summer school and getting help. And at the time, I was horrified. I was horrified. I was already, having some social issues, but I was really horrified by the fact that I had to go to summer school. And really, honestly, the best thing that could have happened to me was that, because it made me more successful down the road. I think people are always so afraid to let their children fail. No, it makes you more successful down the road. I think parents need to watch how they label their children in their hearing, because that certainly affected my confidence and my ability to do certain things as well. So that's kind of my thought towards parents.
Sure. So you went from the girl with the reading problem,
yeah,
to reading anything.
Yeah.
And then the girl with the math problem to successfully completing calculus.
Yes.
And so here you are, wanting to be smart, feeling like you are smart, but not being able to do it. Like, what's that feel like in your head?
Yeah.
You're a child.
It's incredibly frustrating. And I do get frustrated. I don't get anxious, but I do get frustrated. And I can even apply it in a lot of ways to dance as well. I ended up pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in dance, and my problem was always choreography. I could choreograph in my head, but I couldn't get it to come out in my body, and more specifically on someone else's. Getting that communication clear was very, very hard for me. And it's incredibly frustrating to know that I'm a smart person who can do all this stuff and not be able to always get it out. So it's a processing disorder, really. But it took a long time, and to this day it still is. I did a tour of Cambridge and Oxford last year, and I absolutely fell in love with both schools, but predominantly Oxford. And I was sort of sad in a way, because I was like, I would never have been able to get in here, and this is such an amazing place, and I'm absolutely loving this. I'm exploring all these different libraries and seeing all this really cool stuff, and I wouldn't have been able to do a semester there. So that's a little frustrating, and it was frustrating because I feel like in some ways it limited some of my choices. But here's the difference. When my brother was in high school, he was bright and he didn't work at it. And when he went to apply to colleges, he applied to about 9 or 10 of them. And I don't think he even got into half of them. He did get into his top choice, but he didn't get into all of them. When I applied to school, I applied to 5. I got in. I got into my reach school. The only school I didn't get into, I was waitlisted on. And basically, after I had already chosen my school, I got accepted to the school that I'd been waitlisted to. So the difference was the schools I applied for, I got in because I worked hard and I really did well. And maybe they weren't always, and at the time they were the ones I really wanted to go to. Granted, it wasn't Oxford or Cambridge, but that's more of an adult looking back going, that would have been awesome if I could have done that. But that wasn't who I was at the time. And that wasn't, wouldn't have even been on my radar at the time. But I applied to, my reach school was actually Goucher College, and I got in. My top choice was Shenandoah University, which is where I went and pursued a BA in dance. I applied to, I think, Mary Washington, Lynchburg, and Radford, and I got into all of them. I was waitlisted for Mary Washington, but eventually gained an acceptance for there too. So I was very proud of the fact that all the colleges I applied to, I got into, and my brother didn't even get into half.
So you learned, or maybe you had it from the beginning, that work ethic, but clearly it got you to where you wanted to be.
Yeah. Yes, and I had 5 great years at Shenandoah, and the reason why I took 5 was because of injuries, not because of academic level. When I first got there, we had to take one of those like placement tests to make sure you're enrolled in the right classes and stuff like that. And they came back to me and wanted to put me in a remedial math class. That was basic algebra 1.
After taking
Yes, because I don't test well either. I really do badly on standardized tests. And I get the only part that the only place where anxiety comes into play in this is test anxiety. And I kind of have a tendency to freak out sometimes if I don't know something, or if I get frustrated because I know it, but I'm not sure how to solve it, or, whatever. So I ended up having to call my dad and have him send my abstract, because I didn't have like an IEP per se, but I had an abstract, and so that was sent in, and once again my all of my report cards, my transcripts, all of that were sent in to prove that I had taken calculus and didn't need to take the remedial basic algebra class that I wouldn't have gotten any credit for. So when I took my math classes in college, I advocated for myself, and I went up to the teacher first day of class and I said, look, this is my issue, this is my problem, I am going to struggle. What can I do to make myself more successful? And my professor was very impressed that I just went up and immediately said something to her. And so she was like, you can take tests untimed, which was part of my abstract. That was part of one of the things that was on there. I could use a calculator at all times, which by that point everybody was anyway, but that was on my abstract as well. And whatever you need, and here are my office hours, come whenever you need, I'll be happy to. Here's a list of tutors. She was really willing to work with me. And I got a B in that class. And I had to take another math class later on. I went back to the same professor, and I took the math class with her, and I got a tutor, and I did everything that I needed to do. And I can remember we were solving some problems with partners in one of the classes. And this other girl and I were probably the ones who struggled the most. and we were the only ones who ended up getting the right answer. So, and she was pretty impressed by that, because she's like, she was watching us, she was watching everybody, but she was watching us too, and she was seeing how we were going about doing it, and it was exactly the right way. So, I mean, the way I think of things and the way things come out is probably different from the way most people do. Like, most people might think from A to B. Well, I might go A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, to B. You know, so I might take more steps to get there, but I will eventually get there, and I'll generally be correct. So that was great to learn that I could do that. And actually, I really enjoyed those math classes, and that shocked me. And I remember calling my parents and being like, hey, guess what? I really enjoyed math. And I think they practically passed out right on the phone. Because they're like, what?
That's so crazy. I wonder if it was you liked putting in the work and the effort, or do you know what it was that you liked?
I liked solving the problems.
Yeah.
I liked spending time and working my way through it. And I talk my way through it. You know, I'm not sitting there just doing, you know, with my writing with it. I'm actually talking my way through it. And it's funny because on my abstract, I was always told to use a calculator to counteract me making stupid mistakes, because I knew, you know, like 9 minus 2, but then I might write 5 instead of 7, you know, and not even realize it, and then keep going through it and skipping over that mistake. But what I learned to do was to do it by hand and then check it on my calculator. And then when I realized something was wrong, then I would really go back and pinpoint it, you know. So I could really work that way and get through it. That's how I did it. And to this day, if I have to do any computations, I usually do it by hand first, which was not on my initial abstract. It was all do a calculator, use a computer, you know, do everything that way. And I'm like, no, I think I can do this way. And I'm generally correct. I just always make sure I am. I always double check it, which you're taught to do, or you're supposed to be taught to do.
Right.
I actually really do that.
Right.
So,
I love hearing that, because a lot of times I hear parents or teachers are always worried when a student has the ability to use a calculator by their IEP, or
mm-hmm.
you know, in your case, abstract, whatever it is called at their schools. They're always worried, well, my child's never going to learn how to do the math. So it's nice to hear that you actually did it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I actually prefer to do it by hand instead of by, because I taught myself, as I said, I taught myself how to go from different locations. Now, sometimes when I was working with you and I was doing the after school program, and we'd do like study hall afterwards, and I'd go to try and help somebody with math, they would look at me like I was nuts. And I was like, oh, right, no, this is not the way you're learning. All right, let me see if I can switch this around so that you're not taking, you know, 20 steps to get from A to B. Let me see if I can get you from A to B without having to do all these other steps that I'm doing in my head. So, you know, sometimes that was just always kind of funny when I would work on that, and I'd be like, oh, great, fraction. Oh, yay, transferring into decimals. Yay, this is right in my wheelhouse. Okay, well, first what we need to do is look at the book and see what the book is telling us to do and follow those steps. And if you can't get it, it's okay. Ask tomorrow. That's generally my answer on that. It's okay if you get it wrong.
That's
you know,
what homework is for anyway.
Right. It's not about getting it all correct. So,
So when you were in school, did any of your teachers or did your school support you with kind of figuring out how to navigate what you were struggling with, or did you just figure that out?
I think it was a lot of both, to be honest. I had some teachers who were very, very supportive. My Spanish teacher actually was. And in fact, in the abstract, it was recommended that I don't take a language, or if I do, I take it over the summer where I could just concentrate on that, which I was just actually rereading the abstract before we were talking today, because I just wanted to remind myself what it what it said. Um, and I always look at that and I kind of laugh because I ended up being almost fluent in Spanish. I could read, write, and think in the language. I just couldn't speak it. So, and to this day, when I've gone places where they've had it in Spanish, I'll read just to challenge myself. I'll read the Spanish part and try and translate it, and then look over to the English translation and see if I was correct. And I still can do that. So I was actually really, I always thought that was hilarious that they're like, don't take a language. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm taking the language, and I did pretty well with that. So,
I was told that in high school too. I was told not to take AP Spanish. Granted, it was by my guidance counselor who didn't know me very well. I was already taking a bunch of AP classes. And I was having sleep issues, so I think they were trying to like reduce my stress. I don't think I was stressed. I don't know. And she told me not to take AP Spanish, and I was like, "That's my best class. I will go ahead and take it, thank you." And I see what you're talking about. I like to read the Spanish, and it's getting rough. I don't remember it all. Certainly,
yeah.
Trying to speak it, forget it. I'll like start a sentence and then just be lost.
Well, what was really interesting is when I lived in Florida, you end up speaking a type of Spanglish because everybody down there is from Puerto Rico or Cuba or the Dominican Republic or from any Spanish speaking country, or just they grew up speaking it in Florida. So you end up speaking like a Spanglish, and it was actually kind of weird to adjust back to speaking English when I moved to Maryland, because I was so used to throwing Spanish words into things. So I'd be like Mira, look, and I would throw things in there, and I would be like, because every sentence you started down there was Mira, and then you'd say what you were going to say, and then but you would also put in different words for and adios and buenas noches, buenas tardes, but all part of your just daily vernacular, and you just didn't even think about it. So I feel like I was able to keep up a little more with Spanish, even though it was a totally different dialect than any that I learned in high school and college.
Yeah. How long were you in Florida?
5 years.
Okay. Do you want to tell people what you did there?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. And I will say that I played with, and not just in case any younger people end up watching. Ended up, after graduating from college, I needed a break. I had worked so hard since I was in first grade, and I was done. I had a very successful independent research project, and I was very excited about it, and I had a great time with it. But I graduated and I was done. So what do you do when when you have a degree in dance and you're not quite ready to teach? I always knew I was going to end up being a teacher, either that or a performer. So I ended up going down to Disney, and it was probably one of the most riskiest things I had ever done, because I basically moved down to Florida, and I kind of had been assured of a job down there, but wasn't entirely. I'd gone down there a couple months prior to moving. I moved in October. I went down in June after I graduated, and I interviewed for Walt Disney World Company, and I was told that I would probably have a job, but they couldn't hire me until I actually moved down there. So this is where I was like, well, I'll find something when I get down there. So I moved down in October, and I went to auditions, and I ended up getting cast in their Christmas parade as a performer. And when it now gets to the part where you sign a contract saying that whatever you do, you cannot tell anybody under the age of 16 exactly what you did. So I was a performer, and I played with Chip and Dale, Happy, Doc, Sleepy, Sneezy, Bashful, everybody but Dopey, Susie and Pearl, Cinderella's female mite, White Rabbit from Alice in Wonderland, Winnie the Pooh, Gideon the cat from Pinocchio, Jessie from Toy Story 2, let's see, Robin Hood. Oh, how could I forget Robin Hood? That's the first character I ever played with. Robin Hood. And I did the Christmas parade, and in February of that year, I got hired full time, and I worked there for 5 years. And that's where I ended up meeting my husband. So that's where a guy from Oregon meets a girl from Baltimore.
That is so neat. I don't think I realized that's where you met your husband. Maybe I
Yeah.
did. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, he actually lived in the same apartment complex that I was living in when we first met.
and getting to play with all of those characters, that is every girl's dream come true.
Yeah, yeah,
That is
yeah,
really neat.
yeah. I mean, I can go on and on about it, but as I said, I don't want to break that. Even though we signed it almost 20 years ago,
Sure.
my husband and I are very careful.
And
Not
I totally understand why.
Yeah.
I think that's really neat that that's part of it, and
Yeah.
that you guys respect that. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we still love the company very much. We ended up moving back up here because my husband at the time, who was just my fiance, was on the 11-year college plan. It took him 11 years to get through school. Um, so we moved up here so he could do that, and so he could coach football and track and field while he was going through school. So that's why we moved up here. And I will say this too, is that he also learned how to read when he was 4. He had a lot of older siblings, and he just kind of naturally picked it up, and he just figured everybody did that. That's how everybody learned. So he was shocked when he learned that I actually had to work at it and had to, and I struggled with it, and because I'm such a big reader. And it was one of those things where he would like to tell me, well, if you do it this way, it'll be easier and better. And I'm like, no, 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 no. You have to understand that I have to learn this way instead. And basically it has to do, like, one of the big ones is always, ooh, what just happened? There you go. Like tips in restaurants and stuff like that. It takes me a lot longer to figure it out, and I have to do it a certain way. And I will tell you I cheat, and I use a tip calculator on my phone. And he's like, oh my goodness, it's just so easy if you do it this way. And he'll tell it to me a million times, and I'll look at him and I'll be like, yeah, that's not happening. Let me just do it my
brain, not your brain.
Yeah. And so he had, early on, we had some issues with that. And then he took a class about special education and special, different ways of learning styles and learning disabilities and stuff like that. And he came home from class and he's like, I totally get you now. I totally understand what you're trying to do, or how you try to do it, and that you have to do it in a different way. I did have one incident where it came up. Actually, I just thought of this, and this is kind of an interesting story. I ended up working part-time in a dance clothing store for a while, just to make some extra money. You don't make a lot in Florida at Disney, I'm afraid to say. So I picked up this extra job, and I became friends with this one girl. And you talk with people, and when it's slow, you talk a lot. And I talked a bit about my learning problem or disability, and she took advantage of that and started shortchanging the drawers at night. Just a little bit here and there, dollar here, dollar there, the nights I closed, or we closed together. And she ended up stealing several $100s out of the register ultimately, and tried to use my learning disability as the reason why the drawers were shortchanged.
Oh my gosh. So she blamed it on you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was her excuse. And I got called in to a discussion with management after she'd been arrested, because she had also been stealing clothing from the company as well. And she ended up getting arrested, and I got called in, and I almost got fired because they thought that we were working together. And because it always happened on the nights that I closed. And she had a key, so she'd come in and shortchange the drawer.
How did they figure that out or realize you weren't?
Because every time somebody took a bank to the deposit to be deposited the following morning, and whoever opened the store, they were short. And it wasn't a lot. That it might be just like, wait a minute, maybe I miscounted. And that's what she was banking on. She was banking on me having problems with my learning disability with counting money. So that, you know, oh, well, you know, she must have made an error in mistakes and stuff like that. And I was like, no, when I closed at night, this is how much it was in. You know, this was how much had been made. So when we took it to the bank, and there were a couple of times where I was like, oh, we're short. And I'd grab a coin and throw it in, or grab $1 and throw it in so that we were even when I got to the bank. So I lost money too, because I was throwing some extra in there because she was shortchanging it. So, I mean, you do have to kind of be careful on who you talk to about it, because they, you know, I never used it as a crutch. I always was upright and up forth come and said that this is what my issue is. But by that point, when I was working at the store, that wasn't something that I felt really came into play. So I never said anything to anybody about that. So then I had to explain what it was and how, you know, what was going on with that. But I said, but I can count money. And I think the girl who did this to me was thinking that I was stupid because I wasn't able to count money because I was so bad at math. And that's not what was happening there. You know, that's not what was happening. So she did get caught. She ended up going to jail. I did not lose my job. I did not get arrested. Thank God.
I'm so glad. But I never would have, that wouldn't have even occurred to me.
Yeah. Well, it had never occurred to me either that somebody would do that. That they would take advantage of that situation. And I mean, it was very, very sad. She was actually a dancer for the Orlando Magic, which is the basketball team down there. So she was like a cheer dancer for that. And I don't know why she felt she had to do it, but she did. So, but yeah, so that's like the dark side of it.
Yeah, for sure.
What?
For you, it worked out okay.
Yeah, it worked out fine for me. So, but now I'm what I ended up becoming is when I went to Maryland, came back to Maryland. I worked at Gymboree playing music for a while, teaching the classes, and that was a lot of fun. Not exactly my age range and not exactly what my dream job was, but you know, it was a good job for then. And I ended up teaching PE, and that was just a part-time job. And I ended up getting hired to be the administrative assistant. And I love teaching PE, but I really enjoyed the administrative position because I really enjoy knowing how everything works and being on top of everything and being kind of the person who knows how to deal with everything. So it's kind of funny you said that nobody knew what to do when I was gone.
You just did everything.
I just did it, yeah. And you know, I as I said, it was a very difficult decision to make, but it was time to move on. And where I am now, I'm doing a very similar thing with the administrative side. So that was good. It's just I had to use a lot more tech. And as we know from the beginning of this session, tech is not my strong point.
Yeah, Jen and I struggled for half an hour, 40 minutes, but it wasn't just her, it was totally me too. And I do this. But here we are. We made it. And it still says recording.
Yeah.
So I know we're still rolling.
Yes, so that's good. So that's good. So I will say that. Okay. So I will say this. I took a trip. I mentioned Cambridge and Oxford, and I took a trip to England last summer, and I went to and saw those schools and some of these amazing libraries, and I finally figured out what I want to do. And I'm hoping to next year at this time be going to grad school for library science, so I can work in archives or children's literature.
That's new to me. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'd been toying with going back to school for a long time, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I was studying like, well, history or museum studies or something like that. But when I was in some of these amazing libraries last year, I was in Trinity College Library in Oxford, and it was so stunning to see all these gorgeous handmade books, that were made centuries ago. And um, to be in the Bodleian Library, which is one of England's oldest libraries, um, it was just so amazing to see all of that. And I was like, I really, I really love this, and I've always loved reading from the moment I finally figured it out that that's what I should be doing. So I'm looking at that, and I'm very interested in doing more historical archival type of stuff, but I realize that those jobs are kind of few and far between. So I'm also looking at children's literature because um, that's what I do, and work in a school. So that would probably be an easier route to go in. So I'm looking into starting either next summer or next fall. University of Maryland has a program. There's some other programs I'm looking at as well. So,
Oh, I can't wait to learn more. One of my good friends is a librarian, and she was just into town for, still currently is, ALA, American
Library Association.
or whatever.
Yeah.
It's in, the conference is in DC. It's like 25,000 people. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
I happened to meet up with them there, and she was talking, like, one of the workshops is furniture. How do you get cool furniture for your library, and what kind of furniture serves your different purposes? And he said there's more than one workshop about library furniture, and that just boggled my mind as something I never would have even thought of in a whole library.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense. I was talking with Alexandra Deutsch from the Maryland Historical Society, and she said that the archival librarians, they're always looking for some, and they always need that position because there's just so much of that. And so she's like, just shoot me an email when you're done. Or something on that order. I can't remember the exact conversation, but she was like, that's really actually a good field to go into because it's a building field. So that's what I'm looking at to do. So going from somebody who struggled education-wise all these years to doing something so academic when that was never, that went from being artistic and performing to more of an academic aspect. But that's what I want to do. So and I still love performing, and I still do that. And
do you
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I keep cutting you off. Do you have any, like, habits or routines or rituals, anything that helps get you going, that you attribute your success to, either now or then?
Honestly, I don't. It's hard to describe if I do anything or what I do, because at this point it's so second nature. I don't even think about it. I take deep breaths, though, if I ever have to take standardized testing, and I try to take my time and take it slow. Testing is not at all something I do well. It's not indicative of my abilities at all. And so I really struggle with that a lot. So if I have to end up taking the GREs again, which a lot of graduate schools nowadays don't actually require a GRE, especially if you end up having to do online or whatever. So they don't actually require that. So that's good news for people like me, because I'm like, I can't do that kind of testing. Unfortunately, that's one, having to take the praxis has always freaked me out. So that's why I never ended up going that way.
Teaching test for anyone.
Yeah.
Like, you, depending on what kind of teacher you want to be, you have to take a different series of tests in order to become a certified teacher.
Yes. So yeah, it's a little daunting on that aspect, because I do have that test anxiety. The funny thing is anytime I start getting really stressed out or anxious about something, if I do get anxious, I end up reading. And I read everything. I mean, as I said earlier, I used to steal trashy romance novels out of my mom's room. But I also read everything. And like, I just finished a book about the highest ranking African American female WAC during World War II. And it was her memoir. It was very fascinating. But I'll also read, something silly and lighthearted. And I'll reread a lot of different books at different times. It's kind of my comfort thing. When I'm stressed out, I just read. Because for me, that was how I coped with everything. Was once I learned how and figured it out, that was my coping, and it's been a coping mechanism for so long. So anytime my husband notices that I'm just like flying through book after book after book after book, he's like, okay, she's stressed out about something. I'll leave her alone.
And it sounds like you must have a really strong visual of your brain, just going back to that Dr. Dolittle story you told, where you literally just saw yourself in that world.
Yeah. And that's exactly how it is. I mean, when I'm reading, I'm not actually, I mean, when I'm reading words, I read the words, but I'm actually visualizing what's going on so that I'm in the story. It's almost like I'm reading a movie, that I'm seeing what's going on while I'm reading, and I'm actually not entirely seeing the words as words in front of me. I'm just seeing the pictures of what those words create, if that helps at all. But I also think that, I mean, and yes, I do have a strong work ethic, and sometimes I'm just at the end of that, and I just need to not do anything for a little bit. Because I do get, you get tired. But, as for other coping mechanisms, as I said, it's so hard to say now because they're all so ingrained in me that I don't think of them anymore. As I said, I have to, like, if I'm looking at something like an essay or something like that, I sometimes have to calm myself down and breathe a minute, and I pull out a piece of scrap paper and I write down my talking points of what I want to remember to say. I did that today, actually. For this, I sat down and I wrote down all the talking points that I wanted to remember to say. And the funny thing is I haven't had to refer to it once, but just the act of writing it down helped me remember the things I wanted to say. So I do that. I think that must be a coping mechanism right there. Granted, I can't remember if I was taught that in an actual English class or something I picked up along the way. I'm pretty sure I was taught on how to write, put down the talking points first, and then you can form them into your, then you write your introductory paragraph, then you can write with the talking points in, and then you write your closing paragraph. I still do that, and I don't think everybody has to do it that way, but that's often how I do it. And because I do that, and it might take me 5-10 minutes to do, it doesn't take me long to do that, to brainstorm like that. When I was in college, I could write like a 5-page paper without even halfway thinking about it. I would just write down what I needed to say, and then I'd sit down and start going for it. And that was my other thing, was with writing, now that I think about it. I can't always sit there and like write the introductory paragraph. I just sometimes just have to start writing. So free writing for me is how I often cope and how I often deal with things. And then I can go back and edit it, which is why I could write a 5-page paper in like an hour, because I would just sit there and write it. And then when I was done, I could come back and add the introduction and the concluding paragraph and reformulate what I needed to and copy and paste and redo it, form it into something else. But I just needed to write it all out first. I was also the type of person who, you gave me an assignment that was due like 3 months from there, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I have so much work to do to do this, and all these other things I have to do, and oh my goodness, I have to do this, and then I just sit down and do it. I would just sit down. Okay, let me just type here, and okay. Oh well, that's done, and it's not due for another 3 weeks. Okay. So I was not a procrastinator on that kind of thing. There are certain things I procrastinate on, but that was not one of them.
I love what you said about writing too, because the way you approached it was just kind of like sitting it out in bits and pieces, not necessarily in any particular order. I think that's a lot more authentic to the way real writers write and the way we do it in
Hmm.
school. And although that works for some people, other people don't think like that. And really, if you're looking at a professional writer, that's not the way they're writing either. And they write, this many words, and then they only end up using
Yeah.
much of it. But because in school we're so limited in time, and because the students have to show certain knowledge in a certain amount of time, then we're taught to write in this one specific way, but it's not real. So it's nice
Right.
nice to hear you say that. I like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we've been writing for 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's true. When you had to have like a certain count of how many words for a paper, I never worried about that because it didn't matter. Whatever I wrote was going to be, with that amount of words or more. There was one time in fourth grade I had to write a paper on George Washington, and I remember thinking, but there's so much to put in, and it was only supposed to be like 2 or 3 pages long, and I think mine ended up being I was sick when I had to write it. So basically, my parents wheeled the computer into my bedroom, and my dad sat there and wrote it while I dictated what I wanted to say. And I think this paper ended up being like 20 some pages long. And I turned it in, and they gave me a B because it was too long.
Most kids would have been like, I'm sick, I'm not doing that.
Well,
And you did it and overdid it.
yeah, well, my parents were also very supportive, being both teachers. They were like, no, you're getting this done, even if I have to sit here and type. In fact, I had a carpal tunnel or I think it was more tendonitis in my wrists from typing so many papers in college that my independent research paper, my dad actually had to come up and type the first draft of it for me because I couldn't type. So he came to school one weekend and typed for me, and I had to dictate again. Um, but that also helped me a lot because being able to talk it out and sometimes not be the one who has to actually record it helped me out a lot because I was getting my thoughts out, and then I wouldn't have to I wasn't thinking about, oh, I have to answer this or I have to do it this certain way. I was just getting it out there. So that's like free writing.
Yeah.
It was just me how I could get things out, and that really, really helps a lot. The age of the computer really helps me. I love writing by hand. My handwriting's horrible. So being able to type everything up on a computer was great. Unfortunately, I had a lot of writing that semester, and my wrists were shot. So
I can't even. I mean, I wrote a decent amount in college, but not that much. My hands weren't hurting.
yeah, well, I think my part of my problem was that I wrote like I played the piano. So I would like lift my wrists and have proper handwriting, piano playing
Yeah.
positioning, and that caused the issue in my wrists, probably more so than how much I was writing. But I was taking a lot of history classes at the time. And I was working on my independent research paper, which was, a lot of writing and a lot of research. So
I often suggest to students to voice record themselves before they write if they don't have someone to talk to. And a lot of them at first are hesitant because they don't want to take the extra time.
right.
But now we live in the world of voice dictation where you can dictate and the computer will type it.
Yes.
A lot of times there's a lot of anxiety around that because you see the words as they're getting typed and the computer doesn't recognize your voice perfectly and there are errors, and sometimes it can make it harder to get out. But my students who actually give it a try love recording just their voices.
Mm-hmm.
and then it solidifies what they want to say. And sometimes they go back and listen and type, and other times they just type because it's already in their head.
Yeah. And that's for me. If I write, like I wrote out my talking points earlier today, and I don't have to reference them because I remember them now in my head, what I wanted to say. I was afraid I would, if I didn't do that, I might forget to say something that I really wanted to make a point of saying, such as like, don't sell your children short just because they have a learning issue. The other one is, and you've seen it too, where you have parents who are just afraid to get their children tested and are afraid to acknowledge that their child doesn't learn the way people think children should learn. Because I've learned, and I'm sure you have learned too, that everybody learns totally differently. Nobody actually learns the same way. So, but that it's okay. It's okay to get them tested. I think at one point in time, especially when probably, since they're all pretty much contemporary of us anyway at this point, at one point in time, there was a stigma attached to anybody who had a learning issue or ADHD or ADD or, any problems like that. There was always seemed to be like a stigma attached to that, so that people didn't, they didn't want their child to have that, to have to deal with that, so that they would sometimes, and I've seen parents do this, totally deny the fact that their child has a problem. And, I've seen that happen where kids have left a school because their parents are like, they didn't want to hear what the school had to say. And I've also seen it where they've gone to another school and then they run into you later and they're like, oh, you were right, But I feel like the earlier that if somebody tells you there's an issue, you should get it looked at. You should look into it. If a teacher tells you there's more in someone's head than is actually coming out, like my second grade teacher did, then that definitely should be a key right there to get it looked at, to get them looked at. And even if there's nothing there, great. But if there is, at least and you can put that plan in place so that they have the more success and they don't have anxiety or frustration. I mean, I wasn't really an anxious person. I was more of a frustrated person. My brother had anxiety and like applying to colleges. He was in my parents' room every night. Well, what if you don't get in? Well, what if you don't get in? And my mother got mad at me when I was applying to colleges because I wasn't doing that. And she's like, well, what happens if you don't get into the colleges you applied to? And I looked at her and I said, I applied to a few more. And she was like, I was like, duh. And she's like, wait a minute, what? Because that had never occurred to her, because my brother would be in a room at midnight pacing back and forth, anxious as anything. And I was just like, I'll just apply to other schools. So that, in that level, anxiety wasn't an issue to me. I'd already solved that problem. My husband does accuse me of worst case scenarioing everything, and then I work my way back. So I will go to like the worst case possible and then solve that problem and then bring it back and solve other, how lesser ways of having it, so that when it's time I actually have to solve a problem, it's nothing. And so he always kind of laughs at that I do that. And that's, I guess, one of my coping mechanisms or techniques of dealing with things is, what's the worst case that can happen here? Okay, that's the worst case. So what's the next case? What's the case before that? What's the, until I solve it, and then I don't have to be anxious about it. But as I said, I do get frustrated when I can't get things out the way I want it to, So that's why I write it down first, and I talk my way through it. I've talked through this interview several times since I volunteered to do it.
I do that all the time. I'll get this funny look on my face, and someone will look at me and be like, "What are you doing? What are you talking about? Why are you laughing?" Like, "Oh, I was just thinking about whatever."
Yeah.
Whenever I had to do report cards, I never really wrote them until the last minute. But I was thinking and thinking and thinking, and I always knew exactly what I wanted to say about each student because it was already in my head.
Right. Yeah.
But I wanted to have it all thought out before I put it down.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I would do is I would probably write what I wanted to before I actually wrote the comments down. So.
And to piggyback off what you were saying to parents, like, get your kids tested, it's okay. As a teacher, having that information is so incredibly helpful.
Yes.
And I don't have to go through the process of trial and error to figure out how your child might be learning, what might be going on, what his strengths and weaknesses are, because it's not always evident. Sometimes we see something, one of the most common things that I tend to see is everyone gets labeled with ADHD. And
yes,
that's what it is. Maybe it's not, but there's so many other things that sometimes might look like that. But when you dig deeper, it can be something else.
Yeah.
A lot of times, like if you have a language-based learning issue, like a receptive language issue, where you're struggling to understand words that are going into your head,
mm-hmm.
sometimes it looks like you're not paying attention because you're struggling so much to understand that language that
mm-hmm.
you're not getting what the person's saying, and then they think you're not paying attention when you really are. You're just not.
Yeah.
It's so helpful as a teacher to have that information in hand without spending however long it is trying to figure it out. Let alone if it's a child in a public school with lots of kids where the teachers don't have time to get to know the child on that level.
Yeah.
It's amazing to be equipped with that information.
Yeah. That's why I was always really glad that I ended up at the school I ended up at. And I've had conversations, especially with my parents, about this later on, that I firmly feel that if I hadn't have gone to where I had gone to school and learned that I had a learning disability, that I had issues, that I learned how to cope with them and all that sort of stuff, it made me successful in college, and so I completed college. But I firmly feel that if I had stayed going in public school where I wasn't the best student, but I wasn't the worst student, and maybe I struggled, but I don't think it may not have come up again. I really think that it would not have come up again. The learning, that issue that I had that was mentioned when I was in second grade, I really don't think it would have come up again until college. And I think I would have gone to college and have been completely overwhelmed about, number one, the workload, number two, how to work around my problem, my issues, how to work around it. By the time I got to college, I basically knew. And as I said, it would take me an hour to write a 5-page paper it didn't take me long to do. I could just sit there and boom, and it was done. And anything longer than that, it still didn't take me that long because I knew how to do all of that. But I feel like if I had not gotten the background education that I did, I probably would never have graduated. I think I probably would have ultimately dropped out because it would have been too hard and too tough. And even though I had a huge work ethic, I think by that point I would have been so frustrated because I couldn't do what I wanted or how I wanted to do it. So I really do think that being where I was and getting diagnosed, even when I did, as late as I did, really helped make me more successful. And, really helped me just figure out what I want to do. I mean, nobody you can still figure it out when you're in your 40s,
Absolutely. And I believe that you should always be growing and always be changing. And maybe you stay with the same career, maybe you don't, but you're always, as an individual, should be seeking to improve yourself and seek out the things that make you feel happy and fulfilled, and absolutely. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. I hope it wasn't rambling.
No, I think this is great. And it's, I really enjoy it when it's someone I know well, like I know you pretty well, but I still found out things I didn't know.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I haven't really talked to you in the last
year or so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Several years. But it was good to talk about it. Working with children the way I do too is I want people to know, and I'm not embarrassed by any part of my story. As I said, the only reason why I wanted to shut the door earlier is because I was going to talk about the fact that my parents denied the fact that I had a learning problem, and I didn't want I didn't want my father to feel bad about, mistakes or anything that he had done, because they did the best they could with what they knew at the time. And, yeah, I didn't want them to feel bad, so.
Yes. We all have a parent thing, every single one of us. My kids win,
Yeah.
it's just the way it is. I also
Yeah.
really respect that every parent does the best they can with what they've got.
Yes.
And we may look on that at the outside and judge it and say it's not right or it's not good enough, but I think that with very few exceptions, every parent does absolutely the best they can, and they want the best for their kids. And I try and remember that as a teacher and someone who works with kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for coming. I'm glad we got
Thank you.
worked out.
Yes, me too.
And we will have to catch up soon. I wanna hear updates on library school.
Yes, I will.
All
It'll
right.
be great. All right.
Bye.
Bye.